I would like to welcome our viewers to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, episode 3, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies here at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I encourage you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be accessed on our website. I am Siseko Khumalo, your host and a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program, as well as a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. My guest today for this episode is Assistant Professor Jesse McCarthy, who is jointly appointed in the Department of English and the Department of African and African American Studies here at Harvard. His research is concerned with the intersection between politics and aesthetics in African American literature, post-war or post-45 literary history, and Black studies. Professor McCarthy's dissertation, The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War 1945 to 1965, argues for reinterpretation of Black literary aesthetics in the early Cold War and for the value of a discrete periodization of that era. He is also interested in modernism, film, poetics, and translation. While a graduate student at Princeton, he founded a digital humanities project based on the Sylvia Beach archives held at Princeton's Firestone Library called Mapping Expatriate Paris. Jesse's writing on culture, politics, and literature has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, The Nation, Dissent, The New Republic, and N+1. He also serves as an editor at The Point. Jesse, welcome. And today we will be discussing your book, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul. And I just want to start off with a question on orthography. There's an author's note that you put at the beginning of the book where you make the case for the decapitalization of the orthography of black or blackness as you use it throughout the collection of essays. I wonder if you could kind of give us an expanded kind of perspective, especially because we're in conversation with you today and not just merely reading you off the page. So would you give us a bit of an idea as to why necessarily that particular selection? I know you argue this in the author's note in the book, but I think for our viewers who are interested in reading the book, it would be interesting as well in that respect, yeah?
Absolutely. I'd love to comment on that. And first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. You know, one of the funny things about the author's note is it sort of came about by necessity. I was in the process of sort of submitting the finalized manuscript for the book. And as often happens in these cases, you're going through multiple rounds of checking with editors. And I was given a version of my manuscript that was returned to me with the orthography corrected. That is to say, every instance in which I used black, ethnym, demonym, as we might call it, it was capitalized to a capital B. But I should hasten to add, so was white.
Okay.
So all the W's were also capitalized. And needless to say, as a writer, we feel very attached to our choices. But these choices are also heavily symbolic, and naturally I sort of felt that I couldn't accept this kind of intervention in my manuscript without some challenge.
For sure.
The editors at the press effectively got back to me and said, look, we recognize that we didn't necessarily ask you about this, but our official style guides have just changed. And this is what we're sort of required to go with now. And I said to them, look, I think I understand the reasoning, and there are arguments that can be made for both capitalizations. But from my point of view, I think there are, as it were, philosophical and also to a certain extent, I would say, literary, historical, or traditional reasons that I myself would invoke to oppose these changes. And we kind of had this back and forth, and they basically said, well, look, if you're going to, if you're going to insist, we're going to need some kind of validation, basically. And they wanted to be indemnified, essentially. And so I said, well, I have no problem with that. I'll include an editor's note, and I'll explain. And basically what it comes down to for me are a few things. One, I think I would draw a distinction, for instance, in between the use of black and, say, the choice of the word Negro. Famously, W.B. Du Bois initiated a kind of an echoing, I would say, sort of orthography activist movement in the early 20th century to push, and he successfully pushed, the Times and others to capitalize Negro. Yes. And I think that's absolutely appropriate. When it comes to black, I have a couple of issues. One of them is that if we fall back onto essentialist categories, we're going to have a coherence problem that extends to, for example, the problem of whether or not you're going to capitalize other sort of quote-unquote color demonyms. So, for instance, the W in white, some people have argued for the B in brown, and so on and so forth. In my view, if we pursue that route, either we have to be coherent, and then we're going to apply it across the board, which for a number of reasons, I mean, even many people who are in favor of capitalizing the black tend not necessarily to be on board with the others. The other thing I would say is that, from my point of view, if you look at the, there is in fact a history that we can consult in terms of, a kind of exploratory usage of the capitalization, particularly one that kind of got anchored in sort of the late phases, I would say, of the Black Arts movement, particularly in the mid-70s and so on and so forth. But we also see there a number of writers, to me, I would say very heavily influentially, for example, someone like Toni Morrison, who for a time adopted and then sort of regard, for a number of reasons, it to be an inconvenience and return to a lowercase b. Finally, I would say that I'm somewhat influenced, I would say, in this regard by the philosopher Fred Moten, who I think has pursued a project that's very interested in thinking about, I would say, on the one hand, a kind of de-essentialized blackness, but also one whose qualities, I would say, are diffusive and dispersive to a certain extent, that make blackness available in certain kinds of ways. And I think I'm at some level attracted to that notion. I will say, though, and I make clear in my note, I'm not opposed to people capitalizing it if they want to. I think it's perfectly fine to do it. I think that if you're going to capitalize it, you should probably, have some arguments and considerations as to how and why and whether or not it's coherent with other kinds of orthography. But I think it should be a choice. It should be up to the writer. What I do sort of take umbrage with is having my publisher and editors impose it upon me.
Yeah, no, for sure. And okay, there's a lot that's going on there already that I want to kind of unpack with you a bit. But one of the things that and I think you've mentioned this twice already, if not 3 times in your response, is your objection to the essentialization of blackness, right? And I'm thinking that one of the critical things that comes to mind as you're saying that, and one of the critical things that I kind of respond to as I'm reading your author's note, in getting into the text, is Jesse thinking, for sure, you're laying and mapping out a really, really rich history, right, as to one of the reasons why. As to the principal reason why you're choosing to decapitalize, right? And that history is necessarily as per the development of blackness in African American literary circles, right? And as I'm reading you're mentioning Angela Davis, for example. You're mentioning Toni Morrison, And these are scholars, interestingly, who are in conversation with Blackness as it is located on the other side of the Atlantic, on the African continent. And so I'm curious about that dialogue, right? And whether or not that transcontinental, intercontinental conversation is happening, as, for instance, you're staking the objection to an essentialist understanding of Blackness. I wonder if my question is
No. I think it's clear. It's also an important question and one that I think in many ways, in very productive ways actually, has followed much of the history of Black thought. And this actually in some ways gets to the heart of it for me, because on the one hand, I think there's a risk in the capitalized usage for certain kinds of slippage. So sometimes people may be using it, and what they really mean in context, in a particular paragraph, in a particular passage, is actually something like African Americans.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But Blackness doesn't only belong to African Americans, obviously. And in fact, I think if we're thinking about a kind of richer and diasporic notion of Blackness, we're going to need, I think, to take into account its variegated difference. That is to say, there's a lot of reason to group different kinds of Blackness on the one hand, even within the United States of America, and we might say the Americas, including Canada, including Central America, the Caribbean, of course. Sometimes you'll get references to New World Blackness.
Yes.
There's obviously the continent, but within the continent, an enormous variety, of course, as well. And one could go beyond. I mean, I'm often at pains to point out to people that, we really, I think, are at a point in our intellectual trajectory where it's important for us to actually embrace an even broader global Blackness and to think about, for instance, Blackness in the Middle and Near East, Blackness in the Indian Ocean. We could talk about Melanesia. There are a lot of ways of thinking about a broader and more expansive notion of Blackness. And this is why, to me, the small Black is not diminutive, actually. It's actually a more expansive notion, but one that, in some sense, allows for that variety to sort of have its place under that umbrella, right? And to me, I think that's actually, I know it may seem slightly evasive, but I think it's actually more precise in the sense that there's less risk of a kind of metonymic slippage where you're really talking in one instance about one particular area of Blackness, but sort of pulling in the whole in a way that's not necessarily leaving room in ways that it should.
For sure. And I wonder then, I think that's a really rich response because of, I think, necessarily the work that we're trying to do with the Black Archive visual podcast series, which is to kind of, in the first instance, reignite an intercontinental conversation, right, between Blackness as we find it in the United States, but also Blackness as we find it on the continent. And I think you're quite right. The African continent has a variety of Blackness and its articulations. And in part of the work that I'm doing, I am, to a certain extent, labeling that variety even as intra-Black conflict, right, to a certain extent, because there are differences as a result of how we identify post, I suppose, on the southernmost tip of the continent, in any case, it's post-1820, right, the settler arrival, right? So there are ways in which even Blackness itself ceases to be a homogeneous identity. It becomes incredibly varied and incredibly contextually specific, depending on, I suppose, the epistemic outlook, right, that particular group or that particular individual takes on. But I'm curious then about how we strike up that conversation of intercontinental exchange in Blackness, and if it is possible, recognizing necessarily these nuances, and these site specificities, right? And to use a very simple example, and I think one that really captures the similarities, but also radical differences with how Blackness is experienced, for example, in South Africa and the United States. In South Africa, you have a Black man, for example, being lynched by his fellow Black community through what we understand as necklacing, right? If he is seen to be putting the community at risk. Whereas lynching in the United States is a Black man lynched by whiteness, right? So on the one hand, you can say, okay, we can have these solidarity movements, these solidarity lines, but in that very example, that very simple example, which in the South African context comes up even to today, right, in the sense of necklacing seen in particular parts of our communities, is something that exists. How then is there a possibility, let me rather put it like that, is there a possibility for us to initiate such a dialogue, considering all of these site specificities and differences?
Well, I think I would say that there is a possibility and there's a necessity. And in a sense, I think of this as one of the kind of highest aims, not the only or exclusive, but certainly one of the highest and most valuable aspirational kind of goals of something like Black study. That is to say, we know for a variety of reasons and over a very long extended period of history that the study of Africa, of African peoples, of African cultures, of the study of Afro-diasporic cultures as they evolved in other places in the world, notably in the New World, in the Caribbean, in the United States and in the Americas, was largely demeaned, neglected, excluded, marginalized in, mainstream academic research. And, there's been a necessity, therefore, for Black thinkers, scholars, writers, and for Black people in general to establish and create those archives, those studies, to place a focus on these subjects that either were being distorted willfully or neglectfully, or just merely ignored, very much to our detriment. And that detriment is not simply because, one result of that is, only having access to the past or to a sense of oneself through others, a kind of version of Du Boisian double consciousness. It's also, a terrible lack of access and therefore a kind of ignorance about this very variety, right? About the variegated and, context-specific and incredibly rich and also extremely, extensive millennial history and cultural diversity within the Black world. And this, I think, I can't sort of emphasize this ever enough, which is to say that, to me, the pursuit of Black study, in some ways, first and foremost, should be reparative in this sense, that it should, therefore, not be interested or invested in what is primarily a kind of simplifying, essentialized Blackness, but exactly the opposite, a kind of spectrum, right, and opening out a kind of prism that allows any Black person anywhere, right, to look through it and suddenly see how much more there is and how much richer, even if one's particular context is different, one can still learn so much from, say, the South African experience, even if you're from Alabama. One can learn so much about, the Nigerian experience, even by studying Caribbean Blackness.
For sure.
There are, of course, are going to be all of these, interconnected places and spaces. And I think, when I think about projects like Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic in the 1990s, and that's a book now that's sort of canonical. It opened up the field in really important ways. It's been criticized since. But nonetheless, it seems to me like an important kind of milestone step on a general intellectual trajectory that places Black study in the service of Black people everywhere as a way not to collapse identity and Blackness, but actually the reverse, to open it up and to bring its differences into conversation with each other.
No, for sure. And the mention of the study of Black culture, Black life, brings me to another conceptual clarification that I have in the text. So the opening essay of part 2 is very, very interesting for me for a number of reasons. The first is the question around the validity of claiming, for example, that we have a particular tradition within Blackness. And I put that out broadly because I think of the way that I'm hoping that this conversation develops, right? So I know necessarily that in that particular essay, you're talking about specifically the poetic tradition and whether or not we can necessarily trace, we can make a claim of a Black poet, right? Whether it be in the United States or elsewhere in the world. But I'm interested, for example, as we get into that, around the distinctions maybe that you might make around rhetoric and philosophy, right? So these are two disciplines that I would say are incredibly closely aligned, but at the very same time have incredibly profound differences. And, as I read that essay, something pops up for me that kind of demonstrates that difference, where I see that I'm actually reading a literary critic's work. And this is not necessarily a philosophical analysis, right? Which a lot of people can find boring, and literary criticism much more exciting, right? Just because, I suppose, of the way in which we navigate the questions that we pose. But I wonder if you would be keen to say a bit about how you conceptualize those distinctions, because in the collection of essays, for example, one of the things that I do come across is that you do pose philosophical questions. One can find philosophical questions, and in fact, I am even tempted to use the text as part and parcel of my teaching because of the kinds of questions that you're posing, right? But at the same time, McCarthy's not necessarily a philosopher; he's a literary scholar. So I'm curious about that particular distinction and how you would conceptualize it, not only in the text, but also just more broadly in terms of disciplinary-wise.
Yes. It's an excellent observation. I mean, part of the truth there is that, I would certainly identify primarily as, a literary critic and not, as you say, as a professional philosopher. With that being said, I was always drawn to philosophy, and at one time I thought I might sort of go into philosophy, but there are a couple of reasons why I didn't.
Care to share?
Because in some sense I think they sort of bear upon your question about philosophy and rhetoric. One of the things that I found as I was studying philosophy, particularly as an undergraduate in college, and I always read heavily in philosophy, even through my graduate studies. What I tended to find frustrating about philosophy was a kind of insistence on sort of what won't be considered, what won't be looked at, what will be excluded from
a delimitation of sorts.
A delimitation, that's right. Typically in order, I mean, and there's a value to, establishing that, for reasons of clarity, for reasons of cogency. I understand those moves. But at the same time, it always struck me that it meant that there was so much that's, profoundly interesting about human experience, about human expression, about the documents themselves and the texts that philosophy bases itself upon, that kept getting left out. And, by the time I sort of got to the stage where I was reading, some of the later iterations of Western philosophy, particularly, the school of sort of post-structuralism and deconstruction that was drawing attention to some of these very problems of delimitation. I think I sort of took the path of saying, I'm more interested at the end of the day in the messiness of literature and the kinds of or even something more broad like rhetoric. I'm more interested in what goes on there and the freedom I have to be a little bit more wide-ranging in the objects that I'm reading and considering and the kinds of claims that I can make. And I'm actually okay with sacrificing some of that. I would say they would argue clarity, but I would argue to a certain extent a certain kind of closed-mindedness in order to be able to ask certain kinds of questions and pull in certain kinds of materials, as Benjamin would say, into constellation, that if I were pursuing certain kinds of formal philosophy, analytic philosophy dominant in the traditions where I was in school, right? Simply, my professors actually wouldn't even allow. And finally, I would just say about that, one way in which I think I incorporated, however, my thinking in regards to my readings in philosophy is that I think at its best a literary criticism is always philosophical.
For sure.
It doesn't mean that you're writing a philosophical treatise, but it does mean that I'm not simply an antiquarian. I'm not simply interested, or even in a kind of positivist sense, merely a historian of the history of literature. I'm interested in what looking at certain kinds of texts and objects and expressive objects, sometimes strictly speaking literary objects, but also other cultural objects, allow me to kind of how those help me think about moral problems, metaphysical problems, ethical questions, political questions. I'm interested in what they make available to thought.
So thanks for that response, Jesse. And I just want to take you to a section of this particular essay. And the essay is titled "To Make a Black Poet." And I want to demonstrate precisely what you've just said, where you say, literary analysis, literary criticism is always philosophical. And you say here, analyzing, for instance, a poem that, that you're subjecting to this particular argument, you're saying, does fragment 47 describe a positive or negative experience? Like in that particular question alone, right? You're asking about precisely the very nature of, I would say that that's a philosophical question, right? Where you're saying, is this particular poetic composition making a particular claim about goodness or badness, right? How do we experience it, right? Is it devastating or exhilarating? Are positive and negative useful or even applicable categories for eros? Or is this simply a neutral observation, a statement about one's powerlessness when eros commands? And I think here, this is what I'm talking about when I say, and this is why I wanted to go into that distinction between rhetoric and philosophy. So here we've got a constellation of philosophical questions, which when treated individually, right, we would have to, as you say, delimit a couple of stuff. We're going to say, okay, we're not going to necessarily trace the history, for instance, of this particular composition. We're not going to situate it in context. We're just going to take it and we're going to ask these particular questions about it, right? And each of the questions would then, I would say, give us a philosophical analysis. And I wonder, as you say, the richness that comes of that. So I wonder, the question that I would put to you is, do you critique us, philosophers, necessarily for having the blinkers, right? To say, we're going to go to a text, we're going to forget everything about the text, its originations, its context specificity. We're going to forget all of that, and we're just going to look at the text and analyze the text in that context. Do you Are you critical of us for that? And if so, how do you see the benefit of interdisciplinary conversations enriching the experiences of our students, whether it be, for instance, students here at Harvard or students in other institutions across the globe?
Well, there's this well-known, one of the most famous kind of banishments in the history of philosophy is, of course, Plato's banishing the poets from the Republic. It's particularly relevant, actually, to the essay and the passage that you're quoting from, because I was interested in this essay in doing a kind of I'll say, a kind of slightly provocative reading of the poet Sappho, and for several reasons, which I'll get to in a moment. But it's always worth asking, and I'm certainly not the first. This question has been asked for thousands of years: why it is that Plato feels the need to banish the poets. And I think one possible answer to that is that, in a way, he's afraid of the power of the poetic. He's afraid. I think he sees in it a rival source, a source of authority, and indeed, as he says, he fears the sway that it will have over people's minds.
Well, this is one of the critical reasons why you have this very, I guess, a chastising position of the philosophers against the sophists, for example.
Absolutely.
They say, those people ensnare and trap people,
That's
whereas
right.
what we pursue as truth.
Is the truth.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it's precisely that. And so Sappho, in some sense, is on the other side of the line. Sappho is outside. And I'm interested in that outsider knowledge, which is so interesting, right? Because Sappho is sort of pushed out by Plato of the realm of truth by virtue of her being a poet, yet is no less fundamental, if I can use this term, to the Western canon, to our idea, both ancient and contemporary, of what poetry is. And it's really fundamentally Sappho who popularizes the lyric mode specifically, as the kind of prevailing and dominant mode of poetry, so that when we go into the bookstore today, primarily what you get is not epic poems or didactic poems, but lyric poems that really follow ultimately from a template that Sappho set and made popular. But one of the things that I was fascinated by in my reading of Sappho was that there's this sort of occluded or buried history of describing Sappho as black. And in fact, what's really fascinating to me about this history is actually that you can track it over time and find it sort of tracking very well with the history of racialization itself. That is to say, in some of the earliest accounts, she's sort of merely described as sort of dark and ugly. But as you move, upward through the centuries, by the time you get to the Renaissance, she's actually being referred to as nègre, right, Negro, and yet, in much, I would say even contemporary classics, that part, this kind of history of a Western, and I want to be clear here, I'm not making a factual claim about Sappho's race. We don't actually know what Sappho looked like, and I actually don't care that much what Sappho actually looked like. But it's incontrovertible that there is a history of an imagination of Sappho as dark, as black, as raced African, in fact. And when one combines that with I would say, sort of the notorious fact about Sappho, right, which is her sexuality, as I say in my essay, there's sort of a claim to be made that Western poetry, in some sense, has at its foundation a black queer poet. But that's not often how that history is spoken of or read or taught. And I think it's interesting that those things right? That both are sort of excluded. That poetry is excluded from the domain of truth, and yet not completely excluded because Sappho was always read and people were always interested in coming under that sway nonetheless. And simultaneously, that there seems to be an intimate connection, at least at an imaginative level, in between that exclusion and the force of poetry and poetics, and simultaneously something like an otherizing in terms of race, and for lack of a better term, a kind of queerness in terms of sexuality. There are debates about, scholarly debates about whether we should properly think of Sappho as, lesbian or bisexual or other. But there's not really much debate about, what you would essentially say is that she represents a kind of desire that, at an absolute minimum, pushes against a kind of normativity of eros and of desire. And I think that's a pretty compelling question, it seems to me, and one that actually allows us to do a great deal of thinking about race, about sexuality, about poetry and its relationship to philosophy and its relationship to history. But that's not the kind of thing that I could probably get published in a philosophical journal. But as a piece of literary criticism, I think it works.
It does, and I think that for the better part of it, this is one of the things that philosophy lacks, right? It's a beautiful discipline, don't get me wrong. As a philosopher, I quite enjoy it, but I think one of the reasons why I often find myself reading in literature, reading in music and musicology is because I want to expose both myself and my students to the world as it is, and to then pose philosophical questions of and to that world, as opposed to locking ourselves up in a tower and, conducting amazing philosophical intellectual experiments. But I want to take us back to the book, back to the introduction, and you'll forgive me, I'm going to jump around the book because I think to a certain extent, there's a lot of interconnectivity in the book, and you make a very, very beautiful, you pose a very beautiful question at the start of the book, in the introduction to the book. And this is a question that I think a lot of us are thinking about, not only in literature, not only in philosophy, not only in history and historiography, but also in political science and political theory. You say that what do people owe each other when debts accrued can never be repaid? And I think that that's a profound question in relation to how the history of slavery has played itself out. Wherever there's been slavery abolition, there's been the compensation of slave owners and their property for the loss of their property. When the refined form of slavery through its articulation as apartheid ends, we don't have a reparations conversation, we have a truth and reconciliation conversation that doesn't necessarily get at justice. And I wonder if you'd care to say more about that question, because I think as I say, it's a deeply profound question, and it has incredible implications for Blackness globally.
Yeah, it's in many ways this is one of the most challenging and the most difficult, I think, questions that I try to address in this book. And I want to be modest about it. I don't, and this is, I should add, one of the reasons why, again, perhaps as a literary critic, I sort of favor the form of the essay. These are my attempts to come at these questions, and I hope to, stimulate conversation. I don't pretend to have the final word or final answers to offer. Whether the final word could ever be had is, of course, also potentially a philosophical question. But one thing I'll say on this question is, when it comes to Blackness and its relationship to the history of slavery, I think we have some very, very difficult things to attempt to work out. There's I would say a certain kind of there's a certain kind of reactionary argument that likes to point out that slavery is in human civilization a kind of age-old phenomenon. It's taken place all over the world in all kinds of cultures throughout recorded human history. There's no denying this. I mean, Orlando Patterson, in his wonderful book, Slavery and Social Death, made this point and did an extensive, and I still think probably unparalleled, comparative study of systems of slavery and enslavement globally and across history. With all that being said, I think it's very important to think about Blackness specifically and its relationship to slavery as one that is fundamentally, specifically located, historically, at a juncture, and I think this is the part that's important because I don't think it's a coincidence, at the juncture where we have the emergence of what in the academy we like to call modernity. Okay, right. The turn out of, let's say, in the mid 15th century, from in particular, a European system of then primarily feudal states. Linked to Asia through the Turks, and here Venice, of course, played a pivotal role, whose economy was largely centered in the Mediterranean and linking it through trade routes to the east. That suddenly begins to dislocate, right? And you have the opening up of the Atlantic, and you have the pursuit, particularly early on by the Portuguese, of a colonial project down into the African continent. And you have the emergence at that very moment. I mean, Brodel talks about it. I mean, we have extensive histories of capitalism, of the emergence of capitalism in the form, in the recognizable modern form itself, right? The emergence of the first banks at this very moment. Okay? Which is to say that the slavery that is of particular interest to us, that produces Blackness in the modern world, is intimately and inextricably bound up with the development of modernity as a project that has its anchoring in early versions of capitalism, that could be mercantilism, so on and so forth, that ultimately develop into the kind of capitalistic modes of production that we're very familiar with today. And that means that we have to think about, slavery and Blackness in relationship to a system of commodification. And that, of course, is extraordinarily different from earlier and other forms of slavery. It's not to say that other forms of slavery are somehow not, not as bad, or that's not the point. The point is that there are going to be qualitative differences and implications. Ian Bauckham has a great book called Spectres of the Atlantic, in which he uses the notorious example of the Zong. Right? This was a slave ship in which the cargo, the enslaved Africans aboard, were thrown overboard by the ship's captain in order to retrieve the insurance money on his quote-unquote load. And that's the kind of thing, right, that doesn't make sense in Greco-Roman systems of slavery, right? Because slaves were not insured. There was no market for them in that sense. Whereas these slaves were insured at Lloyd's, a company which still exists. Right? And these are the kinds of things that we need to think about, I think, when we're thinking and talking about the very complicated relationship between the materiality and the concrete kind of problem of commodification in the modern world and its relationship to Black experience, in particular relative to slavery. All of that, I think, is something that I want us to really insist upon. And then we have the question of a kind of the adjudication of certain kinds of moral claims and the relationship between moral claims and something like what you evoked, a kind of question of political philosophy. What justifies the social contract? What makes it such that I should obey your laws? What is due to me such that I can recognize myself as a citizen who is treated, in such a way that I am, seen as equal and valid and given the kind of recognition that then obliges me in return
to uphold
the social order, to have some kind of relationship to the state. And those questions, it seems to me, I'm absolutely in favor of keeping close track of the material question in terms of commodification, its histories, damages, reparations, what we are owed, and how we might, I think, carefully and specifically do certain kinds of reckoning and accounting within that. But I am also interested in not allowing us to completely collapse this question into the material. That is to say, it seems to me at the end of the day, people are still going to have to reckon with, given all of that history, what is owed to me and what I owe to others, and how we think about how that relationship is mutually just and validated in ways that ultimately, I think, cannot be reduced to the monetary. In other words, even if I'm given, somebody does certain account, we go back through my family history, we find, my relatives in the Carolinas, and based upon that, we're going to make some kind of calculation, which is going to be complicated for me because it's really hard for me to put a numeric value on how much I feel is owed. But even if we could, I don't think that settles things for me. To me, you can't simply pay people off for historic wrongs, because at some level, I think, what actually needs repair, among other things, is our sense of the social contract itself, is our sense of how we stand philosophically, historically in relationship to each other. And that means that a certain kind of work, I would say, of something like moral education actually needs to take place. And I think people sometimes think of that as a kind of sentimental point. People need to change their hearts. To me, it's not actually sentimental so much as it has to do with
the very fabric of the social contract.
And forcing that as a point of recognition, right? That in some sense, you have to take on board certain things in order to get certain things. If you want to be called American, you want the benefits of, U.S. citizenship, then you need to think about the relationship of Dred Scott to you having a passport, right? Because there's a profound relationship there. Dred Scott's case is crucial and central to creating the notion of a national, right, identity. Citizenship prior to Dred Scott was defined primarily in relationship to the state. That is one of the states of the Union. Right. So our passports are, things like that, I think, are things that people should be required to acknowledge and to grapple with. And that's, I could say more about that, but these are some of the complicated elements that I think I would bring into play.
And I'm following you to a point, Jesse, and then I have maybe an objection, maybe a
please.
question.
Yeah.
How do we take seriously the work of moral re-education and the work of socially re-engineering the social contract when the very fact of dehumanizing an other on the premise of their skin color, on the premise of something that we are born into, it is not by choice. When that has not kind of achieved or has not been considered by the other through the structural capitalist framework that they have instituted as legitimate of citizenship is already way too far. I think that's a real. I think you're at step number 5 of the conceptual framework that you're building. Step number 1 is this being is human, right? So I hear what you're saying about the requirement and the necessity for moral re-education and the very idea of kind of rethinking our society, but I'm struck by, and we see this playing out, United States, South Africa. You and I have a certain level of cultural, social, and political capital for the very fact that we find ourselves in these institutions, for the very fact that we can recite the histories of our countries off the top of our heads as if it's, counting to 10, right? There is something that we are afforded. But similarly, and in saying that, in a community or in a context where nobody can immediately recognize that Jesse McCarthy is a professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University, the fact of your blackness is what comes up first, right? And to a large extent, the systems that we operate on, where the cost of living is incredibly high, where people can't make ends meet, the fact of that blackness means that because I don't know that you're a professor, I will immediately treat you as a second-class citizen, even in the 21st century. Now, how do we... And I think part of that for me comes from the fact that there hasn't been a reckoning with blackness as human, right? Now, I agree with you to the point where you're saying we cannot monetize that, right? Because I think even that is quite crude and in fact plays necessarily into the continued dehumanization of blackness, right? To say, okay, we'll pay you off, then that will be that for that particular history. But there is something that whiteness, through the various political philosophies of Thomas Hobbes, of Adam Smith, of all of these characters, how they have created a particular economy that associates property, wealth, with the category of human and citizen, right? So how do we, and this is the biggest objection, I think, that in the South African context we're dealing with. It's, we've used a principle of Ubuntu without a restorative and retributive justice framework. And what that has meant is that whiteness in the context of South Africa can continue to dehumanize, debase, and erase blackness without consequence, right? So how do we... I'm struggling with... I'm in agreement with you, but I'm struggling when it comes to that, to say, what do we do with that? How do we... Because there is an invested intellectual tradition. Forget the racism of Hegel and Immanuel Kant, et cetera, et cetera. The structure of the structure and the structuring of the state and the economy, right? And I think one of the scholars who really does a phenomenal analysis of this is Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition, right?
Absolutely.
Where she traces the distinctions between the public and the private realm, right? So she does this amazing work where she traces how it is that one is able to participate as a member of the polity in the public realm through being propertied and lording over a particular household, which is, of course, attached to status, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we think about refashioning and reimagining that world that is so deeply rooted in those economic structures that, as I say, without that declarative knowledge that I'm dealing with a professor in front of me, we are always and necessarily, and I think it was George Yancey in this country who actually did quite a fascinating analysis precisely of that, to say at a particular point that my professorship, the fact that I am a professor at an Ivy League institution, matters not to a white woman or to my white neighbors who at some particular point will feel threatened by me just for the very fact that I'm a black man in the neighborhood. I know it's a deeply complex
No, it
question.
is. But I mean, so I address this question in my teaching. It comes up, and I often say to the students, I have some bad news, which is that I think. And it's partly why, even though I know it's complicated and takes a long time to sort of say, why I bring up the sort of deeper historical background, which is to say, one way of thinking about Black study, and it's been articulated, by many folks, is as a critique of the modern world systems that intellectually, ideologically, economically, politically were centered around enslavement, property, and capitalism. And the unholy trinity of these things. And I think that there are many of us who think of, therefore, Black study as not the as it were, the end stop or the solution, but the beginning of the counter-philosophy, if you will, that is at only the very beginning of the road, but nonetheless on that road to undoing that world. The bad news is that if it took 500 years to get to where we are now, and we're only now beginning to reverse course,
It might take another 500
it might take
more.
another 500 years, right? So it might well be that the project that we're invested in is one that, bears its fruit, long after our, immediate descendants are gone. But even if that were true, right, that wouldn't make it not worth pursuing. And, when we talk about philosophy, it is, I think, interesting and important to note one thing, reluctantly we might say, that you speak to the philosophers of the Enlightenment, they did sort of, project the value of their philosophy far into the future. Alas, in many ways, for better and for worse, perhaps on a more nuanced account, those effects are deep and have had ramifications for the future history of humanity over the longue durée. Why couldn't our kind of philosophical awakening have the same? Why couldn't the next 500 years be fundamentally about a kind of awakening of the Black world intellectually and philosophically, and the installing, perhaps slowly at first, and then with gaining traction, of a philosophical program that begins to undermine and undo, reverse engineer, however you want to think about it, a world that will level these playing fields, will begin to dismantle some of the reflexes, because I agree, they're deeply ingrained reflexes, that will begin to create a world in which the hierarchies, the insistence upon property and the securing of property through violence, as outmoded, discredited, and no longer available not only for intellectual reasons, but, and this is of course always the crucial part, because the political economy and the economic and sort of the basis from which people are, as it were, negotiating their position in the world has also been leveled, right? And that's, you know, something that, you know, I'll just say quickly as an aside that, you know, I also think one of the reasons I think Black studies is extraordinarily important is because I personally would like to see a great deal more of kind of intellectual energy in the academy and elsewhere. I'm not saying there isn't any, but I'm just saying I'm in favor of continuing to think very pragmatically about how we build certain kinds of, whether they be political associations, whether they're connections with, you know, folks who are working pragmatically in the economic realm, to build and develop the capacities, whether they're institutional capacities, economic capacities, however we think about that, whatever we want those to look like in the Black world, on the continent, in the Caribbean. You know, there used to be a lot of talk about, you know, the interest in creating a kind of a really robust, you know, Caribbean Union, you know, on the kind of model of the European Union. And I think we still see today that kind of project has sort of languished, that the ability of the Caribbean to sort of assert itself as an economic bloc and say, look, you know, we don't want the next 100 years to just be white folks coming to, you know, lie on the beach, and that's what all we have to offer.
And or give us aid.
Or give us aid, right? And so at some point, we need to take our destiny into our hands and figure out how together we can be stronger and push out certain interests, or at least take certain kinds of control so that we're, you know, the parity in terms of the power that we have to negotiate gives us the things that we need and allows us to build the things that we want on our terms. I think all that kind of work is extraordinarily important.
And I've got a question for you there, Jesse, on the kind of pedagogic responsibility that is thrust on us as a young generation of the academy. And I say this because I work in decolonial scholarship back at home, and one of the biggest criticisms that I have is, as we are critiquing the European Enlightenment tradition, as we are attempting to articulate what a decolonial or decolonized South African society, academy would look like, I do not want, and I think a lot of my colleagues as well don't want this, but I don't think that we're forthright enough, both for our readership but as well for our students. We're not forthright enough to say that in creating this new world, we don't want a perverted inversion of power, right? So, and I always say to my students, think about it as an hourglass, right? So the sand has fallen down to the other side, and what you're basically saying is, let's flip it, right? And I think that part of that lies in a very, it is an enormous task, one that I think is incredibly taxing, specifically on Black intellectuals who are already doing so much in the academy, right? But there is a certain sense of responsibility that is required of us to kind of be careful about, because, you know, I think I often look at it and I see the students that you folks teach in the college here, and I look at some of the, you know, some of the students in the graduate programs here, and folks who read here don't often tend to kind of go and work at McDonald's, right? Folks who read here tend to kind of
go work at McKinsey,
precisely, right? Or become part of federal government, either as an employee or something or the other. But it's like, this institution has prided itself and prides itself in producing the leaders of society and the world. And when I look at the black students, I often think, what are we bequeathing to them? And I say this of whether it be Harvard University, whether it be a university of the Witwatersrand back at home, a Rhodes University back in South Africa, or UCT. I ask myself the question of, and of course the demographics are much more radically different in those institutions, right? Where we have the majority of our students being black students, right? And I wonder, I often sit with myself and I ask myself the question of what, in me teaching this group of students at Fort Hare, what am I giving them? What is the kind of world that they're going to create having read with me for 3 or 4 years, right? And I think that constitutes part of this pedagogic responsibility that I'm talking about, which I don't think we have the luxury of copping out of. And some colleagues might have the luxury of copping out of because of where they are positioned socially and politically on the spectrum. But I want to come back to to the book, and I think this this conversation that we've been having now leads me to another observation that you make in the introduction, where you declare that this is not a collection of political essays, right? And I'm paraphrasing you here, but you say, for example, that this collection is not a book of political essays about race and the moral crisis facing the United States. And one could argue the moral crisis facing the global attack on democratic values. And yet, I find myself confronted by the political in essay 1 of both part 1 and part 2, right? Like I'm reading these essays and I'm thinking, I can't walk away from these essays without thinking about the political implications of what it means, and specifically because the work that you're doing is incredible, because you're working in the realm of the aesthetic, right? Whether you're writing about a painter who is in the shadow of a master, a black painter who is in the shadow of a master, or the idea of a black poet, right? We're working with the arts. And the common objection that I get from white liberal circles in South Africa often is that you should not marry the aesthetic with the political. And yet you do that in these 2 essays, and you do that in a very beautiful way. And so I wonder why it is that you kind of want to shy away from the political work that you're doing, even though, as I say, you're necessarily in the realm of the aesthetic.
It's a good point. And I think I might be able to tie it in actually to the point you're making earlier about responsibility. We have a tremendous responsibility, and I don't take that for granted at all. One way in which I think that responsibility manifests itself is that our students come to us to use a term that had currency for such a long time in debates in political economy with respect to Africa and colonialism, but underdeveloped deliberately. So it's extraordinary, and a little bit frightening to see how much our students, I think, don't know, and not because they are not brilliant, not because they are not curious, but because, in fact, what is knowable, what is sort of generally available to the public imagination and discourse at any time is actually quite
Limited?
Quite limited, and quite often deliberately so. And so, for example, my students are routinely shocked when I teach them about, Maurice Bishop and Grenada. And they can't believe that this series of events took place as recently as, the 1980s, 1983, and that they've never heard about it, as if it's fallen in a black memory hole. And as Ralph Trujillo talks about, we need to think about the ways in which the production of history and memory itself, right, are silenced by power. And so at all times, we're contending with the power of prevailing ideology. I don't want people to come away. I think part of why I sort of have that kind of slight disavowal in the introduction is because I don't want people to come away from my book thinking that I have a kind of
manifesto.
Manifesto, or a quick, easy kind of phrase or buzzword, or it's not that kind of a book. I'm not here to deliver, the medicine in that sense. But it's true that, I'm somebody who, as I said before, I was always drawn to the literary, to the aesthetic, to that complicated space that for me is opened up by certain kinds of experience and perception that in many ways, I have to be careful how I say this, in many ways do in meaningful and important ways exceed the political. But the fact that they exceed the political doesn't disentangle them from the political. And part of what I think I'm often trying to do for people is to say, there is actually a way to attend to that which is powerful and important to us in the aesthetic that transcends the political, without thereby depoliticizing the work of art. If the work of art considered on its own terms as a work, or the work of art in the sense of the work that art does in the world, which of course necessarily, almost by definition, is social and therefore political and cultural and all of these things anyway. And part of what I do try to do, I think, more or less successfully in the essays, is to try and use the power, the aesthetic power of objects, to on the one hand, put forward certain kinds of interest and value that will actually force people to look beyond the political, that will actually force people to think, oh, wow, maybe this actually touches on things that I wasn't even aware it could, but at the same time to never allow them to slip into a kind of aesthetic appreciation that completely elides or escapes political consideration, and in particular insofar as that political consideration bears upon the contemporary. And this is why, to me, it's always about bringing these things into tension with the now, the time of the writing of these essays, right? Which is to say, the ideological horizon of the present. And that, to me, is what's is sort of the distinction. I think there is a way in which one can have a kind of crude instrumentalization of art for political purposes, which is never very interesting.
Yeah.
But that's also often easily detected. I always wonder why people get so exercised about that, as if 99% of people all the time can't tell that that's happening and either approve of it or don't. But it's not that interesting a question. On the other hand, it's actually often quite subtle and quite difficult to actually perceive one's own ideological investments in aesthetic appreciation, right? Or the ways in which one is a work of art forces us to confront certain contradictions that we'd rather not look at too closely.
But Jesse, on that note, I'm going to ask though: is it really, right? Is it really that difficult to confront our biases and prejudices when and I ask this coming from the South African tradition, specifically the art tradition, right? I think about Dumile Feni's African Guernica as an example. Beautiful piece of work held in the Nahix collection at the University of Fort Hare as an example, and was exhibited recently at the Javid Art Gallery for the inaugural exhibition of the opening of that gallery in 2019, going into 2020, and Feni borrows from Picasso
Right.
around the question of Guernica, but he is making a pointed statement about and of the apartheid state of South Africa, right? The refracting of black ontology, represented as the receding human forms, for example, and these animal-like forms that are shaped in the form of a human being atop cattle. You know, he's making the claim that we can no longer recognize ourselves because our very humanity is being pummeled by this system, right? Now contrast that with an older South African white artist, Pierre Neef. And he's painting these gorgeous empty landscapes, right? Justifying, giving us imposing a European picturesque on an African landscape, necessitating J.M. Coetzee's objection, right, to that when he does that book, White Writing on the Culture of Letters in South Africa. So there's, whenever I'm seeing a piece of, whether, and even when I'm listening to music, right, I'm always primed to see how a piece of work necessarily meets me at a particular level. If it's a Pierre Neef that I'm looking at, I'm looking at the explicit and intended erasure of indigeneity on the southernmost tip of the African continent. Right? These people do not exist. It justifies conquest. Necessarily, we must civilize these empty, vast, and beautiful lands. Right? I look at Feni, and Feni says to me, that conquest, that civilizing mission has resulted in this beast-like human that I can no longer recognize. The music of Letambulu in 1976 then gives me an exciting and interesting reading where she says, Ndiyabuza abazali bayoyika nenzalo yabo, right? She's asking about one can read that song against Dumile Feni's African Guernica of 68, because she's asking the question of why are the current generation of parents afraid of their own children, right? So the question that I would pose to you is it not necessarily a matter of the political predisposition? If I exist in the mainstream, of course it will be difficult for me to discern how I read the aesthetic through my prejudices and my biases and my political affiliations or political affiliations or political identities, right? Whereas if I am not in the mainstream, I am constantly being invited to see in the aesthetic the political that is always embedded in the aesthetic, right? So is it maybe a question of viewership, right? In the sense of, and I think you do this as well when you're discussing when you're discussing specifically music. I think, I forget now whether it's Essay 3 or Essay 4 in Part 1, where you're going to an exhibition, you're listening to music, you've created this playlist, and necessarily you're confronted, number one, by the fact of your blackness in a foreign country, but number two, how that blackness intersects with a particular tradition in this particular exhibition, and how that exhibition itself ought to be read against a longer history of a particular music history. So is it? In that moment, I didn't see an obliviousness. I didn't see I read somebody who's critically aware of their position as that position intersects with music, with art, and with space architecture.
I mean, here I think we're getting back to some of the points we were both making earlier about that in some sense were disciplinary, right? And had to do with the question of what you can kind of, get into the space of reflection, or what has to be delimited and excluded. And this is the kind of messy, overlaid experience that I am interested in. All right, where the music, the art, the architecture, the question of viewership, the question of one's skin color, the question of the, in this case, Basquiat, the question of the artist's skin color, and the French couple that I overhear saying, a child could have made these works, all collide, right? And they don't collide neatly. And yet, I think partly, and it's interesting to me, even in the examples you evoked, that I think one of the things that comes up for us again and again, and I think not at all coincidentally, is something like history. And this too, I think, I think one of the things that I'm invested in is historicizing politics, right? And that's something, for instance, in the American context, I should say in the U.S. context in particular, we're so bad at. There's such a desire to reduce certain kinds of conversations, to the so-called policy debate. Get involved with policy wonks. But your point about reparations is unrealistic. And it's like, but the bigger problem here is not even the question of, good or bad policy. It's actually, I think, the ways in which we want, I think, again, for ideological reasons, to dissociate political questions from historical ones. I think what the art, good and bad, reactionary and colonial, and revolutionary and emancipatory show alike is that the expressive work tends to inevitably encode its ideological presuppositions and investments and connections to its historical moment. And that's why I think, to a certain extent, of course, the work isn't sufficient by itself. You need the question of interpretation. You need the question of the viewer. There's also, but that moment, that interaction, if we analyze it and we give the space for that to be kind of unfolded in all of its complexity, in all of its sometimes confusion, but a confusion that need not remain in the state of confusion, right? I mean, things can be complicated and maybe not even resolvable, and yet, to a certain extent, more clearly seen, right? Or certain strands pulled apart and therefore made available to examination in a way that they weren't before. That, to me, is where a certain kind of thinking, a certain kind of intellectual work, a certain kind of form, the essay, might come in and assist us. And I think one of the more popular essays in the collection is called Notes on Trap, right? About trap music. And here, this is, to me, was quintessentially a kind of problem in this regard. Here's this, I grew up on, golden age 90s hip hop. And it gets to be, 2013, 2014, the music is changing, right? The sound is changing. And you wake up one morning and you're listening to Future and you're thinking, I don't even know what this is, right? And I don't recognize it. But worse, I start feeling like I have reactions that are reactionary. I feel like I sound like my parents. There's no lyrics anymore. There's no message. It's just, what is this noise? But there's an opportunity there, the opportunity that I wanted to take deliberately, to question myself. Right? Okay. Do I have to have this reaction to this music? Have I actually afforded this music the kind of listening that I myself preach is so important for other kinds of music? Why am I so hasty to dismiss it? Let me disallow myself from doing that and do something which is very important, especially because of the racialized history of aesthetic appreciation in a U.S. context, which is to take this music seriously instead of dismissing it as, trash, as noise, as party music. It's only for the club. It has nothing to say, right? What if it does have something to say, right? And then, in order to engage with that, though, right, philosophy might get me some of the way, but
it's not going to get
it's not going to get me all the way, right? And what I'm going to get to is not necessarily going to be a final and completely clear or even coherent answer. But the work that I think the essay does, and other people have told me that it did this for them, and to that extent, I'm like, well, then it was worth it. Is people said no, but it did help me listen differently the next time. It did help me to see or understand my own reaction to something in a way that I couldn't see that before. And I think anything that helps us to see further, to hear better, to think more clearly, even if we don't have final clarity and the final word on it, is important. And and there's a history, again, as I say, and a beautiful tradition within Black thought of taking up, I think, this kind of necessary work, which, again, is also, I think, important because if we don't take it up, oftentimes it simply won't happen. And it will, in fact, be sort of allowed to remain in that sphere where it's not taken seriously. It's not available for serious conversation. It's not available for pedagogy in a classroom, right? But if you can develop the tools and the vocabulary, the texts to actually read, write, and put in conversation with these objects, I think suddenly you open up all of these kinds of new frontiers. And again, that I take to be a modest contribution, right? That's not, I would say, I'm not claiming that that's a revolutionary gesture. I'm not claiming that that by itself decolonizes the academy. But I'm interested in a Black studies that is positively engaged in creating those opportunities for thought, in creating the texts and objects that therefore will constitute a corpus that we can turn to and use and share, right, collectively, and that perform a certain kind of counter-thought, counter-philosophy, and critique of dominant ideological positions, whether they're within the academy or without.
On that note, thank you very much for joining us for today. I think this discussion is so rich and so fruitful that we will require to do a second take. So please join us again for the second part of this conversation with Professor Jesse McCarthy of the English and African American Studies departments. We'll see you for part 2 in just a bit.